Next is Doug OBG with NRDC.
Good afternoon. I'm Doug OBG with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to thank you guys for your work to date and thank ICF for its presentation in the agencies. I think you guys have a very difficult task. It's an enormous document, as I can attest, having tried to read a lot of it myself. There was one thing that I thought you guys brought up that wasn't really brought up by the agencies or ICF, which I think is really how we're looking at this document, and that's the biological objectives. There are very specific biological objectives for the fisheries, and they really are tied back to the overall goals and legal requirements for this HCP. And I'd strongly encourage you to look at really the question of whether BDCP is likely to achieve those biological objectives for specific fisheries. And I'll take two of them just as an example. One is, you guys talked a little bit about some of the through delta salmon survival objectives. And those objectives call for a very significant increase in through delta salmon survival in order to meet long-term abundance targets. Yet the models that are presented thus far seem to show either a slight decrease or potentially larger decrease, maybe a slight increase in through delta survival. And most of them seem to show a decrease in abundance. And I guess the question for you guys, from my perspective, is, does the information presented show that we're actually likely to meet that objective for through delta survival? And if not, what do we need to do differently? To that regard, I'd note that the YOLO bypass restoration is actually already required under the existing biological opinions for the Central Valley Project and State Water Project, so that by 2025 we should have YOLO bypass restored and have fish on it regardless of whether BDCP goes forward, which is a good thing. I don't think that detracts from whether we meet the goals and objectives, but it is one of the real key actions to try to make progress there. Similarly, for longfin smelt, there's an objective to substantially increase the productivity and abundance of longfin smelt, which is primarily driven by this flow-abundance relationship in the spring. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies, as well as independent biologists, have continued the work that Kimmerer et al. Did in 2009 and have helped refine that equation. But the two ends of that decision tree that are presented right now are basically the status quo. What is called the high outflow is basically not much more than today, and a low outflow, which is dramatically less spring outflow than what we have today. And the models that seem presented in the effects analysis show that longfin smelt is likely to continue declining. And again, it's hard to square that with an objective that calls for a substantial increase in abundance and productivity. I guess the second sort of lens to look at it through is adaptive management. And there is a lot of flexibility in adaptive management, but there's two, I think, really key limitations on it. One is that limitation on funding. So you can move projects around, but there's a real limit to how much funding you can put towards these projects. The second, which I didn't hear mentioned, is that all of the adaptive management has to be water supply neutral, according to Chapter 3. And so that means that if fish need more water, if we need to increase flows and reduce diversions, that's not allowed for under this plan without going out and finding some new funding to pay for it. I think that really undercuts the effectiveness of adaptive management in this context. I strongly encourage you to look at it. Third is that there are a couple additional resources that I'd encourage you guys to look at as you do your review. One is that there is a new paper pending at SF Estuaries and Watershed Sciences coming out of some work that Cy and others did, Bruce Herbold et al., looking at the effects of tidal marsh habitat restoration on food webs in the Delta, which largely concludes that it's very unlikely to contribute significant export of food or fundamentally change the food web, but could have some significant benefits for fish and wildlife within the Delta. So I'd encourage you to look at that manuscript that's under review, as I understand it. The second is a review by Jeff Mount, Anthony Saraceno, Bruce Herbold, and Wim Kimmerer of the effects analysis of the earlier draft. And that analysis really not only looks at some of the fundamental scientific questions, but it raises a real concern about the accuracy of the modeling itself, something that Nancy has kind of honed in a little bit on. They found significant, what they termed as anomalies, where there would be more flow provided under the model than what they anticipate would actually occur in reality. And I think it raises a question of how likely the project is to be operated as proposed here, where we have significant benefits shown for some of these measures. And I don't want to detract from that. If we really do improve old and middle river flows so we have far less negative flows, we will reduce the entrainment of delta smelt and should increase the viability of that species. But when the rules say that the old and middle rivers can be more negative than what the modeling shows, I think it begs the question of whether it will be operated the way it is. So I would encourage you to look at both of those two sources, and if you need copies, I'm happy to provide them for you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't have any other public comment blue slips. So looking at the audience just to make sure. Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end of today's review panel meeting. The next steps are for the panel to digest on this whole discussion, continuing their individual and group reviews. They will be deliberating tomorrow morning and will be reporting back out at 2 o'clock with their initial recommendations, with the presenters from today at the table to have dialogue with the panel as well. So thank you for attending, to the audience and to the presenters and panel for your attention today. So that's it, and we're adjourned for today.